Imagine the Vatican, not as you know it today, a place of prayers, solemn hymns, and hushed reverence, but a fortress of shadows, secrets, and forbidden desires. The year is 1501. Candles flicker against marble walls, their light trembling like guilty witnesses. The air is heavy, not only with incense, but with anticipation. Something darker, intoxicating, unholy. Behind closed doors, the sacred becomes profane. Laughter echoes where once saints prayed. Silk whispers against stone, mingling with the clink of golden goblets. And in those chambers, on this very night, Rome's holiest palace will host an evening so scandalous that history would struggle to put it into words. This was no legend, no rumor, but a documented event buried for centuries within secret archives. They called it the Banquet of Chestnuts, and tonight you will step inside that forbidden night. To understand how such a night could unfold in the heart of Christendom, we must first step back into the world of the late 15th century, a world where faith and corruption walked hand in hand. Rome was a city of contradictions. By day, pilgrims journeyed from distant lands, kneeling at golden altars, whispering prayers that rose like smoke to heaven. But at night, those same cobblestone streets turned into markets of flesh and power, where salvation itself carried a price tag written in gold ducats. And no man understood this game better than Rodrigo Borgia, the man who would become Pope Alexander VI. Born in Spain, raised under the shadow of ambition, Rodrigo climbed the church's ladder not through piety, but through family connections and the ruthless art of buying influence. His uncle had already been pope, and Rodrigo inherited not just opportunity, but a hunger for more. By the age of 25, he was a cardinal. By 40, he was Rome's most dangerous player. He was not a shepherd of souls, but a prince in all but name, living in palaces, hosting feasts, taking mistresses who bore him children, and weaving a dynasty from behind holy walls. His name became synonymous with wealth, scandal, and power. And when he finally seized the papal throne in 1492, the world realized that the Vatican had been transformed, not into the house of God, but into the stage for the Borgias, history's most infamous family. But what began as ambition soon spiraled into excess. For Alexander VI, power was never enough. It had to be displayed. Banquets, mistresses, marriages, wars, everything became a weapon to secure his family's dominance. And at the center of it all stood his son Cesare Borgia, ruthless, brilliant, and utterly without conscience. It was this family's hunger for control that would set the stage for the Vatican's most infamous night. Rodrigo Borgia's story begins far from the grandeur of Rome, in the dusty town of Ceuta, Spain, where he was born on January 1st, 1431. From the start, destiny seemed to follow him. His uncle, Alfonso de Borgia, rose swiftly through the church ranks, eventually becoming Pope Calixtus III. And with that election, the doors of the Vatican opened wide for young Rodrigo. At just 25, Rodrigo was made a cardinal, not because of holiness or devotion, but through nepotism, the poisoned currency that flowed through the Church of the Renaissance. In those years, Rome itself was a contradiction carved in stone. Pilgrims filled the basilicas, bowing before gilded altars.
Yet only a street away, courtesans and mercenaries thrived. It was a city where salvation could be purchased, where confessions were whispered in chapels by day and sins committed in alleys by night. Rodrigo adapted quickly. He was no ascetic priest. He was a man of appetite. Lavish banquets, glittering palaces, mistresses whose beauty matched his ambition. One of them, Vanosa de Catanei, a Roman noblewoman, bore him 4 children, Juan, Cesare, Lucrezia, and Joffre. Each of these children would one day play a role in the tangled drama of power, love, and betrayal that surrounded their father. Even as a cardinal, Rodrigo's behavior scandalized Rome. His parties were legendary. His hunger for wealth and influence was insatiable. Pope Pius II once wrote him a letter of rebuke, condemning his shocking conduct in Siena. But Rodrigo was not a man to be shamed. He had larger goals, the papacy itself. By the late 15th century, the papal throne was as much about politics as piety. To rule the church was to rule an empire, armies, lands, and wealth beyond imagining. Rodrigo understood this better than anyone. He moved like a spider, weaving alliances across Europe, collecting benefices, gathering gold, and placing his children as pawns on the chessboard of power. To some, he was charming, generous, magnetic. To others, he was dangerous, corrupt, unholy. But all agreed, Rodrigo Borgia was a man who would stop at nothing. And when Pope Innocent VIII died in 1492, Rodrigo saw his chance. The conclave that followed would become one of the most infamous elections in church history, a carefully choreographed dance of corruption, bribes, and whispered promises. The world was about to meet Pope Alexander VI. The summer of 1492 was stifling in Rome. The air itself seemed heavy with anticipation, for the throne of St. Peter stood empty. Pope Innocent VIII had died, and now 23 cardinals gathered in the Sistine Chapel to choose his successor. The choice would not be guided by prayer alone. In Renaissance Rome, the papal election was as much about gold as it was about God.
Behind the locked doors of the conclave, whispers replaced hymns. Promises flowed more freely than holy water. One cardinal pledged benefices in Spain, another offered titles in France. And at the center of it all stood Rodrigo Borgia, a man who had spent decades preparing for this moment. Rodrigo was no stranger to power. For years he had accumulated immense wealth by collecting benefices across Europe. He had built alliances not through sermons, but through marriages, bribes, and calculated charm. Now, with coffers full of gold and networks of loyalty already in place, he unleashed his final campaign to buy the papacy itself. Contemporaries did not even hide the corruption. Gold ducats passed from hand to hand with the casual ease of communion wafers. Rodrigo promised lucrative offices to those who voted for him, lucrative bishoprics to their families, and comfortable pensions to those in need of persuasion. Cardinals, sworn to serve God, weighed these offers like merchants haggling over spices in the Roman marketplace. On August 11, 1492, the smoke rose from the Sistine Chapel, announcing that the conclave had chosen its new pope. Rodrigo Borgia had emerged victorious, taking the name Pope Alexander VI. It was a triumph not of holiness, but of strategy, gold, and ruthless ambition. To the surprise of many, Rome rejoiced. The city had grown accustomed to Rodrigo, his charisma, his generosity, his flamboyance. When he was crowned at St. Peter's Basilica, bonfires blazed across the 7 hills, torchlight processions filled the streets, and triumphal arches rose in his honor. Eyewitnesses described it as the greatest ovation ever given to a pope. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as though Alexander VI might truly usher in a new era. At first, Alexander played the role well. He restored order to the streets of Rome, plagued by assassinations and lawlessness. He established magistrates to enforce peace and held audiences each week where citizens could present their grievances. Observers praised his efficiency, his energy, even his apparent dedication. Some whispered that perhaps God had chosen wisely after all. But power, like fine wine, does not create character, it reveals it, and Alexander's true nature could not remain hidden for long. Beneath the golden robes of the papacy beat the heart of Rodrigo Borgia, ambitious, indulgent, and utterly determined to turn his position into a dynasty. For Alexander VI, the papacy was not only a throne of faith, but a weapon, a tool to elevate his children, to expand his family's power, and to etch the Borgia name into the fabric of history. What began as a celebrated victory would soon unravel into one of the most scandalous reigns the Church had ever known. What made Alexander VI's reign infamous was not only his own hunger for power, but the dynasty he built within the very walls of the Vatican. The papacy, once the seat of spiritual leadership, became the stage for the ambitions of his children, each of them pawns and players in a dangerous game that would shock Europe. At the center of his heart stood Juan Borgia, his eldest son. Handsome, pampered, and spoiled, Juan was the golden boy, destined for titles and privilege. Alexander showered him with honors, naming him Duke of Gandia in Spain and marrying him into one of the most powerful families of the Iberian Peninsula. But behind the elegance lay cruelty and ineptitude. Soldiers whispered of his arrogance, rivals mocked his ineptitude, and soon even his father's faith in him began to waver. Then came Cesare Borgia, the son who would become both Alexander's pride and terror. Cesare was everything Juan was not, brilliant, ruthless, and calculating. Though appointed Archbishop of Valencia at only 18, the church was too small a stage for his ambition. He longed not for prayers and scripture, but for armies, fortresses, and kingdoms. Tall, striking, and magnetic, Cesare drew admirers and enemies in equal measure. He was the blade his father would use to carve out a Borgia empire. Between these brothers stood Lucrezia Borgia, Alexander's daughter. She was intelligent, graceful, and as much a tool in his father's strategy as any soldier or bribe. Married off to powerful nobles across Italy, she was a pawn in alliances that shifted as quickly as the tides of politics. Some saw her as a victim of circumstance, a woman trapped by her family's ruthless ambitions. Others believed she was an accomplice, fully aware of the deadly intrigues swirling around her name. Whispers of poison, betrayal, and forbidden liaisons clung to her reputation, whether deserved or not. Lastly, there was Geoffrey, the youngest son, often overlooked, married young to secure another alliance. His role was smaller, yet he too was a piece on the chessboard of papal politics. Together, this family formed the infamous Borgia dynasty, a pope who reigned like a king, sons who fought like princes, and a daughter whose beauty and marriages were weapons in her father's hands. Rome watched with fascination and horror as the Vatican, once seen as a sacred refuge, turned into the family palace of the Borgias. But ambition comes with a price. The Borgias were feared, envied, and despised in equal measure. As their power grew, so did their enemies. Behind every smile at a banquet lay suspicion, behind every alliance lurked betrayal. And soon tragedy would strike at the very heart of the family. The death of Juan Borgia, found floating in the Tiber River, would shake Rome to its core and begin the unraveling of everything Alexander had built. The Vatican during Alexander VI's reign was no longer the solemn heart of Christendom. It was a palace of spectacle, a theater where sacred and profane danced side by side. The marble halls that once echoed with prayers now pulsed with music, laughter, and whispers of scandal. For Rome, it was as if Caesar had returned, not in the form of an emperor, but as a pope whose appetite knew no boundaries.
Feasts were the hallmark of Alexander's rule. The banquets stretched deep into the night, their tables groaning under the weight of roasted meats, exotic fruits, and wines imported from every corner of Europe. Gold candelabras bathed the rooms in flickering light, while musicians played melodies that mingled with the voices of cardinals, ambassadors, and noblemen. But these were not simple gatherings. They were displays of power, opportunities for Alexander to bind allies to him through indulgence and spectacle. And yet, beyond politics, these feasts carried a darker edge. Courtesans moved freely through the papal chambers, as welcome as any cardinal. Among them was Julia Farnese. Known across Rome as Julia la Bella, Alexander's celebrated mistress. Her beauty was said to eclipse that of the noble women of Italy, and her presence in the Vatican symbolized the Pope's disregard for vows of celibacy. She walked the papal corridors as though they were her own, a reminder that Alexander's passions could not be confined by Scripture. It was not just Alexander's personal life that shocked observers. It was the way he wielded his sacred office as a tool of wealth. Church positions became commodities. Bishoprics, indulgences, even cardinals' hats could be purchased for the right price. The College of Cardinals expanded, not with saints, but with wealthy families eager to secure influence. Salvation itself seemed on sale. For many, this corruption was not hidden. It was flaunted. Rome's citizens gossiped about the Pope's mistresses, his children, and the endless flow of gold into papal coffers. Foreign ambassadors wrote letters describing the decadence with astonishment, their words spreading across Europe and fueling whispers that the Church was rotting from within. Still, Alexander's charisma made him difficult to hate. He was generous to his allies, protective of his family, and capable of astonishing energy. He listened to petitions, settled disputes, and maintained a facade of justice. But beneath that facade, every act served one purpose: to strengthen the Borgia dynasty. And so, within the gilded chambers of the Vatican, virtue and vice became indistinguishable. Cardinals toasted alongside courtesans. Sacred hymns gave way to bawdy songs. The papacy had become a courtly kingdom, ruled not by humility, but by ambition. But all glittering palaces conceal shadows. For Alexander, the greatest darkness came not from his enemies, but from within his own bloodline. The night his beloved son Juan's lifeless body was pulled from the Tiber River, riddled with wounds, the illusion of untouchable power began to crack. On the morning of June 14, 1497, Rome awoke to whispers that soon turned into a roar. The body of Juan Borgia, Duke of Gandia, and the Pope's favored son had been found floating in the Tiber River. His throat was slit, his body marked by 9 deep wounds. To many it looked less like a murder than more like an execution, a message carved into flesh. For Alexander VI, the news was devastating. This was not merely the death of a son. This was the collapse of a dream, the shattering of his carefully constructed dynasty. Witnesses recalled how the mighty Pope locked himself away in grief, refusing food and sleep for 3 days. He wept openly, pacing the chambers of the Vatican like a broken man, mourning not only Juan, but the betrayal that such a crime implied. Who had killed his son? Was it the work of enemies, jealous nobles, or, whispered most dangerously, his own family? Rumors spread quickly. Some whispered Cesare's name. The ambitious younger brother had long envied Juan's favored position and resented his incompetence. Cesare, after all, had the sharp mind and iron will, while Juan was spoiled and reckless. No proof was ever found, but suspicion clung to Cesare like a shadow he could never escape. Alexander's grief transformed briefly into a call for reform.
In his anguish, he announced measures to cleanse the church of corruption. He promised to limit luxury in the papal court, to suppress the buying and selling of offices, to restrain the moral decay that had become Rome's scandal. A commission of cardinals and canon lawyers even began drafting reforms that echoed what the Council of Trent would only enact decades later. For a moment, it seemed as though tragedy had humbled him. Observers whispered that perhaps divine justice had struck, and that Alexander, broken by grief, might restore dignity to the papacy. But grief, like all things in his life, proved temporary. Within months, the reforms were forgotten, tucked away like embarrassing letters never meant to be read. Alexander's gaze turned back to the future, not through Juan, but through Cesare. If Juan had been his heart, Cesare would now become his sword. Cesare abandoned his role as cardinal, the first in history to renounce such an office, and turned fully to the pursuit of power. Where Juan was weak, Cesare was ruthless. Where Juan failed, Cesare triumphed. And Alexander, still mourning one son, placed his hopes entirely on the other. Juan's murder had changed everything. The facade of family harmony was gone, replaced by a dangerous clarity. Only the strongest would carry the Borgias forward. The Pope, once shaken, now seemed more determined than ever to use every ounce of papal authority to elevate his surviving children, no matter the cost. The Vatican's halls, once darkened by grief, would soon blaze again with ambition. And in Cesare Borgia, the world would see the most terrifying expression of that ambition. Cesare Borgia was unlike any churchman Europe had ever seen. He was young, tall, strikingly handsome, and possessed of a sharp intelligence that made him as dangerous in conversation as he was on the battlefield. He had once been destined for a life in the church, elevated to the rank of cardinal before the age of 20. But after Juan's death, Cesare stripped off the red robes of faith and donned the armor of a soldier. In doing so, he became the first cardinal in history to abandon the sacred office voluntarily, and in that moment, his true career began.
The Italy of 1498 was a patchwork of fragile city-states. Florence, Venice, Milan, Naples, all competing, all scheming, all ripe for conquest. Cesare understood something that few of his contemporaries did. Power was not inherited, it was seized. And with his father, Pope Alexander VI, as patron, he had both the authority and the resources to seize it. His opportunity came swiftly. The new King of France, Louis XII, needed papal approval to annul his marriage. In exchange for granting it, Alexander demanded French military support for Cesare. Thus armed with royal backing, Cesare set out to carve a dominion in central Italy. War became his stage. He besieged cities, executed rivals, and manipulated alliances with a skill that astonished even his enemies. Town after town fell under his banner. His reputation spread like wildfire, admired by some for his decisiveness, feared by many for his cruelty. To his enemies, Cesare was merciless. To his allies, he was calculating and often treacherous. But in every move, he revealed a cold brilliance. Niccolò Machiavelli, then a Florentine diplomat, observed Cesare firsthand. In his later writings, he would hold Cesare up as the perfect example of the prince, a ruler who understood that morality was secondary to power, that cruelty, if used wisely, could secure stability, and that fear often achieved more than love. Cesare became, in essence, the living embodiment of Machiavelli's philosophy. Yet behind his meteoric rise lay the endless support of Alexander VI. The Pope funneled wealth into Cesare's campaigns by selling indulgences, creating new cardinals in exchange for money, and turning the sacred offices of the Church into instruments of war. Every appointment, every ducat, every alliance was a stone in the fortress Cesare was building. For a time, it seemed unstoppable. Cesare controlled vast territories, commanded fierce loyalty from his mercenaries, and stood as one of the most powerful men in Italy. His enemies, from rival noble families to jealous cardinals, trembled at the mention of his name. But such rapid ascent came with a cost. The Borgias were now more feared than respected, more hated than admired. The Vatican itself seemed less a holy sanctuary and more a royal court drenched in intrigue, corruption, and whispers of poison. And while Cesare's armies expanded outward, the Borgias' enemies gathered in the shadows, waiting for the moment when fortune would turn. It was October 31st, 1501, All Hallows' Eve, a night when the veil between sacred and profane was said to grow thin. But in the Vatican, that veil would be torn apart entirely. Cesare Borgia, flushed with triumph after his military campaigns, prepared a celebration unlike anything Christendom had ever seen. History would remember it not as a banquet, but as a scandal, the Banquet of Chestnuts. The setting was Cesare's private apartments within the Vatican Palace, magnificently decorated by Pinturicchio with frescoes of saints and gods, a backdrop of sacred and classical images. The irony was brutal. Painted martyrs and angels looked down upon an evening that would stain the papacy forever. The guest list read like a catalogue of corruption. Cardinals, who should have been on their knees in prayer, gathered shoulder to shoulder with Roman nobles. Ambassadors attended, eager to witness firsthand the excesses of the Borgia court. And then there were the stars of the night, 50 courtesans. Not the common women of the streets, but sophisticated companions, trained in the arts of pleasure and discretion. They had been summoned for one purpose: entertainment. The evening began innocently enough, with a lavish feast. Tables overflowed with roasted meats, rare fruits, spiced wines, and pastries shaped like crowns and roses. Candles dripped wax over golden candelabras, filling the room with flickering light and long, restless shadows. Music drifted from the corners, sweet notes that floated above the hum of conversation. Politics, war, and art, these were the polite topics of the early hours. But as the plates were cleared and the wine flowed more freely, the atmosphere shifted. The courtesans, dressed in silks that shimmered like water, began to dance. At first their movements were graceful, refined, an entertainment fit for nobles. Yet, as the music grew bolder, the silks fell away piece by piece until the dancers moved naked under the candlelight. Gasps and laughter and applause echoed through the marble chamber. The line between performance and indulgence blurred. Then came the chestnuts. Servants swept the tables aside and scattered roasted chestnuts across the polished floor. Candelabras were lowered, placed in circles upon the ground, creating islands of light surrounded by shadow. The courtesans were commanded to crawl on hands and knees, gathering the chestnuts while their bodies glowed in the candlelight. Cardinals and nobles leaned forward in anticipation, while Pope Alexander VI himself sat with Cesare and Lucrezia, watching from a seat of honor. Why Lucrezia was present that night remains one of history's mysteries. Was she complicit, a participant in her family's corruption? Or was she simply trapped, a daughter unable to escape the orbit of her father and brother? Accounts differ, but all agree she was there as the evening descended into its most infamous stage. After the games of chestnuts came the competitions. The men were challenged to prove their virility, to see who could couple with the most courtesans. Prizes awaited the victors: silken tunics, fine shoes, jeweled caps. Servants recorded the scores as though tallying the results of a tournament. What should have been acts of intimacy became a grotesque spectacle, transformed into entertainment for Rome's most powerful men. Johann Burchard, the papal master of ceremonies, was present that night, not as a participant, but as an observer. His duty was to record, and he recorded he did, with the clinical detachment of a notary. His Latin account described the chestnuts, the competitions, and the presence of the Pope himself. For centuries, his words were locked away in the Vatican archives, too scandalous to be shown to the world. But when later revealed, they confirmed what rumor and whisper had carried across Europe. The papacy had reached its nadir.
When dawn finally broke, the candles had burned low, the courtesans had departed, and the Vatican's marble floors gleamed again as though nothing had happened. Pilgrims still crowded St. Peter's, masses were still said, and the Pope still appeared before the faithful with solemn authority. Yet beneath the surface, everything had changed. Word of the banquet spread quickly, through ambassadors' letters, servants' gossip, and the reports of horrified clerics. Europe reeled. Even in an age accustomed to vice and intrigue, the idea of a pope presiding over such debauchery was unthinkable. Reformers seized on the scandal as proof that the Church was irredeemably corrupt. Princes and kings shook their heads, even as they exploited the weakness of a papacy so consumed by its own indulgence. The Banquet of Chestnuts was not merely an evening of excess, it was a symbol, a grotesque mirror reflecting the collapse of spiritual dignity under the weight of power, lust, and ambition. And though the candles guttered out, the memory of that night burned on, staining the legacy of Alexander VI and haunting the Church for centuries. The scandal of the Banquet of Chestnuts had shaken Christendom, but Alexander VI showed no remorse. Instead, he leaned deeper into ambition, pouring every ounce of papal wealth into Caesar's conquests. For a time, fortune still smiled on the Borgias. Caesar continued to carve out territories in central Italy, feared by his enemies and admired by Machiavelli as the very image of ruthless leadership. But history is merciless and fortune is fickle. In August 1503, as the heat of Roman summer lingered, Alexander VI fell suddenly ill. Some whispered it was malaria, others claimed poison, perhaps even a trap intended for Caesar. Within days, the once mighty pope was dead. Rome, which had once cheered his coronation, now watched with suspicion and relief as the Borgia era seemed to collapse overnight. Caesar, still recovering from illness himself, found his power unraveling. Without the papal throne to shield him, his enemies closed in. The Orsini, the Colonna, the rival noble houses of Italy, families he had once crushed, now sought revenge. Even the College of Cardinals, stuffed with men who owed their red hats to Alexander's bribes, turned against him the moment the protection vanished. Exiled, betrayed, and weakened, Caesar's empire crumbled piece by piece. Within 4 years of his father's death, the brilliant warrior prince who had terrified Italy was reduced to a mercenary in Spain. In 1507, he met his end on a lonely battlefield, fighting for a cause not his own, cut down far from the marble corridors where his power had once reached its peak. As for Lucrezia, she survived, married into the powerful Este family of Ferrara. Though scandal would cling to her name, she gradually transformed her reputation, becoming a respected duchess, a patron of the arts, and a woman of influence in her own right. Yet the shadow of her family's infamy never fully left her. The apartments once filled with the Borgias' laughter and schemes were abandoned. Pope Julius II, Alexander's successor, refused even to live in them. Instead, he commissioned Raphael to decorate new chambers above, adorning the Vatican with art that symbolized renewal and dignity. It was as if the Church itself was trying to cover the stains of the past with beauty too divine to be questioned. And so the Borgia dream ended, not with triumph, but with disgrace. Their legacy was sealed, a dynasty remembered less for their achievements than for their excesses, corruption, and the scandal that shook the very foundations of Christendom. The Banquet of Chestnuts did not end with the extinguishing of its candles. Its legacy lived on, whispered in courts and cloisters, recorded in the meticulous diary of Johann Burckhardt, and echoed in the accusations of reformers who would one day shake the foundations of Christendom. The scandal was not simply an evening of excess. It became a symbol of everything critics feared about the papacy: ambition without restraint, power without morality, and desire unchecked by faith. For Catholic loyalists of later centuries, the event was an embarrassment too painful to confront. Many tried to deny it outright, suggesting Burckhardt's account had been exaggerated or corrupted. Could a pope truly have presided over such debauchery? Could cardinals, princes of the church, have watched as courtesans crawled for chestnuts on Vatican marble? To some, the story was simply too grotesque to believe. And yet, the convergence of sources, ambassadors' letters, servants' gossip, and Burckhardt's unflinching notes made denial a fragile defense. Protestant reformers, by contrast, seized on the story with zeal. To Martin Luther and his followers, the banquet was not rumor, but proof. Proof that the papacy had strayed so far from Christ's teachings that it had become the very corruption it was meant to resist. Pamphlets circulated across Germany and beyond, painting Alexander VI as the epitome of a church rotted from within. The scandal fanned the flames of dissent, lending credibility to voices that cried out for reform. The Catholic response came decades later in the form of the Counter-Reformation. The Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563, introduced reforms that directly confronted the abuses Alexander had embodied. Tighter discipline for clergy, seminaries to properly train priests, and renewed emphasis on morality within the Church's hierarchy. The very rigidity of Baroque Catholicism, its pageantry, its order, its carefully staged magnificence, was, in part, an answer to the chaos of Alexander's Vatican. The Church would dazzle the faithful with beauty and ritual, but it would not again allow such open scandal. Yet the legacy of the banquet extended beyond theology. It reshaped how history remembered power. Cesare Borgia, though disgraced in life, lived on in Machiavelli's writings as the model of pragmatic leadership. Better to be feared than loved, Machiavelli wrote, and Cesare was the proof. Even his cruelty became a lesson, stripped of morality and framed as political wisdom. The banquet, with all its grotesque spectacle, became part of that same paradox, a night of shame that nonetheless taught future rulers about the dangers of unchecked indulgence.
For ordinary believers, however, the banquet posed a deeper question. How could the Vicar of Christ, chosen to guard the keys of heaven, preside over such sin? Many reconciled it by separating faith from its flawed leaders, by believing that the sacraments remained holy even if the men who administered them were not. It was a painful but necessary distinction, one that allowed Catholicism to endure even as its shepherds faltered. Today, the Banquet of Chestnuts remains a haunting image. Tourists walk the Vatican halls where it unfolded, gazing at Raphael's frescoes, unaware that beneath their feet once lay the stage of the Church's darkest evening. Historians debate its details, but its symbolism endures. When power loses sight of purpose, when faith becomes a mask for ambition, the sacred can collapse into the profane. The chestnuts scattered across that marble floor were gathered long ago, but their shadow lingers. They remind us that history is not only built by saints and visionaries, it is also scarred by those who succumbed to desire. And in that scar lies the warning of Alexander VI, that even the holiest throne without restraint can become a seat of ruin.